Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy. Great. Well, welcome to the show. Ian, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Taylor.
Yeah, happy to have you. We're just commenting. I love your background. You're much more. I think you got the whole setup. It's great.
It's definitely bright, and I have a lot of fun with the TV in the background with different logos of different companies when I'm live streaming or interviewing myself. I'll throw their logo up there. It's great fun.
I love it. Usually I'm the one that I feel like I have the fancy podcasting setup, but I think you got to be beat by a mile here.
What's even better is writing a little Perl script that I can like make all the lights blink, or not Perl, Python, a little Python script just to make them blink. It's a lot of fun.
Oh, cool. Well, let me introduce you. So, guest today is Ian Douglas. He has been a professional developer for close to 26 years and worked in a whole variety of industries and roles. But most recently, you've been the founder of this tech. Let me make sure I get it correct. Techinterview.guide.
Well, that's the website. Yeah, I just call it Tech Interview Guide. Yep.
Okay. Tech Interview Guide to help. You also do live streaming as well on a regular basis, where you're helping folks with interview prep and kind of resume prep and giving them advice and more insight into the industry. And that's how we got to know each other. Before that, I know you worked at Turing, which is a boot camp based out of Colorado. You also were a lead engineer, director of engineering, a number of different companies in the past as well. So I think you've done a little bit of everything, right?
I've touched on it all. I've done developer relations. I've done pre-sales engineering. I started out in just tech support at a company, kind of progressed into software development from there. From there, progressed into like web development, just teaching myself a lot about APIs and how to build APIs. Most of my career has been back-end systems, a lot of startups, a lot of like tiny little seed stage kind of startups and kind of help them grow. And it's been great fun.
Yeah. Oh, and you also have done some work with interviewing.io. I think it's probably a company that a lot of people are familiar with if they've watched this show, where I think you've been an interviewer for a long time there, right?
I've been on their platform, about 4.5 years now, and I just crossed my 1100th mock interview that I've conducted on their site. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. I have a ton of respect for the team over there and what they're doing. It's a lot of fun being an interviewer there.
Wow. Well, this will be episode 28, I think, of the show. So I got some ways to go.
You'll get there. I believe in you, Taylor.
Yeah. Great. Well, can you share a little bit about your background and kind of your pathway into technology? I think you touched on this a little bit, right? You kind of worked your way into it, but how did you get started?
So my dad was a big gadget nut, and he came home back in 1982 with a Commodore 64. And as a little 8-year-old kid, I'm like, what's this thing all about? And so there wasn't a lot to do. I grew up in northern Canada, like way, way up north in Canada. Wasn't a lot to do in the wintertime, but play hockey or stay indoors. And so I spent a lot of time indoors just going through the manual that came with it, which taught you everything about the basic programming language. And I remember as a kid thinking, wait, so I can give this thing a list of instructions and it's always going to follow those instructions no matter what. And so I taught myself a lot of basic programming. And, back then you could buy magazines with pages and pages and pages of source code that you had to type in yourself because it wasn't very practical back then to transmit software or certainly not send out floppy disks or anything like that. And so they would just publish these magazines with tons of source code, and you'd sit there and code it all in, hope for something cool. And at the end of it, as a kid, you're like, oh, it's a spreadsheet. It's like you're hoping it's a game, or you'd play half of the game and then it switches over to the spreadsheet because you turn the wrong page and you're typing in the wrong code or something. And so it was always really interesting as a kid. And so I knew really early on, whatever I do in life, I want to work with computers, and basically stuck with that all through high school. Although in high school, I started tinkering with little electronic circuits, and I still do. I got tons of Raspberry Pis and Arduinos and stuff like that. And I just got a board the other day that basically does cellular communication for IoT devices. So I'm looking forward to nerding out on that over the long weekend coming up. And so I studied computer engineering. So it was a good foundation of software development, but it was learning how to program to actually control hardware. And so skip ahead 20 years when IoT is really booming, it's like, oh, this is fun. I get to like control hardware again. And so my career started out in tech support at an operating system company in Ottawa, Canada. And from there, I kind of progressed into like actually getting a firmware developer job. So working on really low level code, a lot of C and assembly back then. And then from there, just, okay, well, I want something where I can be creative. And so I got into like web development, teaching myself what we call kind of the traditional LAMP stack of Linux, Apache, MySQL, and then some programming language starting in P, whether it was Perl, PHP, Python, so on. And then just kind of progressed from there through my career. And then I ran my own web hosting business for a while. So I was actually racking my own servers. I ran that with a couple of friends, and then nice. That led into just being like an SRE, where you're like taking care of a data center. I did DBA duties, so lots of DevOps background. And then, meanwhile, also progressing as a software developer. So lots of involvement. Got into it like a lead architect role at SendGrid, had a lot of fun there working with the team and building out some really great APIs, and then started progressing down more of the management path and being more of a hiring manager and really focusing on hiring. And that's really what sparked in me of like, I want to be able to teach people about the hiring process and why we ask the kinds of questions that we do and what's important for us to hear in your answers. And so I started putting together a lot of mentorship material to give out to some students at Turing, where I was a mentor at the time. So I mentored for them for a number of years. And then they called me up one day and they're like, "Do you want a job to teach over here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, easiest job decision switch ever." Got into teaching for 4 years. And I'm like, okay, now I want to like get back into deeper engineering kinds of things or get back into developer relations work. And so I'm just wrapping up a job hunt myself right now, hoping to make a job decision next week, actually, for my
it's
next
exciting.
role. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun just going through interviews again myself and being able to live stream twice a week about like, hey, how's your job hunt going? Let me tell you about my job hunt. Like having to go through leak code problems and all that stuff. Like I've been coding for 25, almost 26 years professionally, but sure, I'll do your leak code problem. All right. And how much not fun that is. But it's a necessity in our industry right now to be able to practice that kind of stuff as much as it's not great. So
yeah, great. Well, that's a really helpful kind of overview. I think the stuck out. I grew up in Vermont, so I also spent some winters, huddled behind a computer, sure. Doing something to it to just make that fan burn as much as possible, right? Maybe get a little warmer.
For sure.
I think mine was torrenting stuff and downloading Skyrim mobs and hoping they wouldn't, absolutely brick the computer.
Right. Nowadays, I think people just mine Bitcoin to keep their house warm. So
yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, so can you share a little bit about how you landed your first engineering job? I think you said you'd always kind of been tinkering, right? But when did you actually start first working professionally? I've heard some people say, while they were in high school, they started doing stuff on the side. Some people said, I waited till I was after college. But what did that look like for you?
So it was after college. So my first job coming out of college, I studied to be a computer engineer. And the company that hired me was an operating system company. They make what they call a real-time operating system, where you can, based on your CPU and your hardware specs, you can deterministically figure out how long each instruction is literally going to take as a slice of time. And so you can time things really, really tightly as far as tolerances. And so I was working for them, and the contract I signed and the agreement was, you're going to work in tech support for 2 years, so you understand everything about everything that you do, and then we'll move you into an engineering role. And I lasted a little over a year, and it was really a lot of frequently asked questions where you're just on the phone or answering a fax or answering an email. Yeah, back then we had fax support. And just answering the same questions over and over. And I got a little bored with that. I tried pre-sales engineering, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed talking to customers. But I didn't want to wait another year to get into software development. And so my first actual like full-time software job, I got through a friend of a friend. And so I've been telling people ever since, like, it's about the networking. You can go blind apply, but networking is what's going to find you a lot of opportunities, and like asking people like, hey, do you know anybody who's hiring? And for me, that's how it got really kickstarted from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell folks that all the time. It's so I worked at a coding boot camp in the past, and it was
Mhm.
often the people who had an uncle or a brother or a cousin or somebody, a sister who was already an engineer, at least worked in tech, right? Worked at a tech
Right, right.
company. And those are the people that often got the jobs fastest out of our boot camp, even if, the technical skills might have been exactly the same or even lower than other people in their same class, but they just knew someone who could at least get their resume in front of somebody, right?
Yeah.
There's the same thing for myself. Was it was someone I called who I'd worked with when I was a recruiter, and I'd placed them in the past, and I just called them. They said, "Oh, we have, if you know a little bit of Vue, we have a little bit of Vue work you can do." And I'm like, all right, sure, I'll start tomorrow, right? So that it really does get to the foot in the door.
Yeah, networking makes a big difference, especially today with, hiring freezes, and especially for entry level roles. A lot of companies, like, there's this huge demand for software developers, but companies think they need senior level devs, and they really don't. Like, they really should take a chance on entry level devs. And so a lot of the people that come hang out on my stream are those entry level devs saying, how do I get my first job? And I always tell them, like, do your company research, find people at those companies, reach out to them, talk to them, but not just trivial, like, what do you do day to day, but also like diving into, like, as you're doing your company research and finding out things about the company, if there's information about the company that you want to find out, but you can't find, those make great questions to those people that you network with. Like, hey, I can't find this information about your company. Do you have 5 minutes to talk about it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, people are happy to get on a phone call if you have very specific questions, especially if you can send them the questions ahead of time. Like, hey, can we hop on a call? I want to ask you these 3 things about your company. Like, everybody's got time for a 5 minute phone call. And if it's just something like, yeah, this, here's the answer, here's the answer. It's like, cool. Can we stay in touch? Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you've got like specific questions you want to ask next time, and not just like, what do you do and what tech stack do you use? Like, those questions get a little boring after a while.
Yeah.
But if you come with like really interesting questions about, hey, I'm curious about this aspect of your company, or I'm curious about how your company does X, Y, Z, like, can you share some of that without breaking NDAs and so on, of course. Got to respect those. But bringing specific questions, like, networking is so much easier.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think even from a technical perspective, if you can bring question as well, like just stuff you're not all that familiar with, I think that's
Mhm.
something that sometimes people are like, oh, I'm not good at small talk, or I don't know how to talk about those things. I don't think I'm very good at small talk, but if I have a question, like if I go, I don't really know how binary search works, do you? Right? Like, I'm not going to necessarily ask that to some random person, but if I'm trying to network with people and that's something that's top of mind, someone probably knows in this group, right? So if
Sure.
if I have
Mhm.
nothing else to talk about, maybe I ask that question, right? And someone's going to go, oh yeah, I can explain that to you. Great. Well, that's a much better conversation I'm probably going to have than, oh, what does your company do, right? And like just
Right.
hoping for the best, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I know you mentioned that you've been interviewing, you're hoping to sign an offer here soon. So this is it's very exciting. So have you done
Yeah.
technical interviews recently? I'm assuming you've probably done the gauntlet.
Yeah, so I started my most recent job hunt back in November. I left that job in December, partly to interview. I was expecting a few offers from some interviews that I had done, and unfortunately, one of them I got rejected because I messed up their interview process. One of them ended up with a hiring freeze, and then the third one I was actually interviewing at Amazon and got rejected from them. But it was for like an AWS certification instructor role, so it would have gotten me back into
Interesting.
teaching. And I made it all the way through like what they call their uh, leadership principles interviews, which are like 5 grueling hours of behavioral questions.
Yeah.
And apparently, if you make it to that, it means you've got all the technical knowledge, but these 5 hours of culture interviews are basically like, are you a good fit for Amazon? And apparently, I wasn't a good fit. And that's okay, because since getting rejected for that job, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to kick back and enjoy the holidays with my wife and kids. And so it was a nice stress-free kind of holiday season. until those fires came through Colorado, because they came within a couple of miles of our house. But
Oh,
aside from
geez.
that, it was pretty low key. We got up in the mountains for a little while, and just relaxed as a family. Worked on some jigsaw puzzles and caught up on podcasts and stuff like that. And then I'm like, all right, now I got to get back into the job hunt. And so looking for jobs to apply for, and going through their interview process. And some of them are like, hey, we've got like your background really fits. Here's this 8-hour process we want you to jump through. And I'm like, how about no? And some of that does come with a healthy dose of privilege of being in this much experience in tech, that I can turn down a position like that. Some I walked away from because as I would do my research on the company, I would realize like, hey, like your team is all male, or your leadership of the whole company is all white. I'm a white dude in tech. I've been around enough white dudes in tech. I've been around enough white people leading companies. Like, could we please have something different? Like, please. Like, it's 2021, 2022. Like, where's the diversity? You say you want diversity, but in practice, when I look at your team page, like, you're not showing it. And so I actually walked away from a few interviews. I had one recruiter reach back out to me, and she left a little note. She's like, I really appreciate that message that you sent to my boss. I'm like, good. I hope it changes something,
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but diversity in tech is really important to me. And so I have all kinds of people on my stream as well that come from diverse backgrounds to talk about their perspectives. So it's not just me saying like, hey, as a hiring manager, these are the questions I ask, or this is how I would respond in this kind of scenario, both as an applicant or as a hiring manager. Like, sharing my perspective is one thing, but I love using my stream to give other people a voice as well. And so tit for tat, I want you on my stream at some point. But just to have other voices and hear other people's perspectives, I think no matter who you listen to, that's not enough. You need to listen to lots of opinions and sort of form your own, whether it's how to build a resume. I've got ideas, you'll have ideas. If someone listens to just me and you end up getting the resume, you're going to think the resume is garbage. If they just listen to you and they send me the resume, I'm going to think it's garbage. Or there's going to be things about it that just seem a little off, because everyone's going to have their own opinion. And so the more opinions you listen to, the more you can say, okay, this is how I want to build my resume. And then that's your resume. You own it. You've come to that decision because of multiple opinions. So yeah, don't ever listen to just one person. That's a big thing that I push on my stream a lot.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Did you have, as you've been interviewing, has there been different types of roles, or are you locked in on one thing? Or I'm sure you probably get reached out to about developer relations, probably sales architecture, instruction focused things, and then just the whole slew of general developer to developer manager, director, those types of roles, right? Are you locked in on one thing, or has it kind of been, let's see if the company's interesting, kind of feeling things out?
That's a great question. I actually had someone on Twitter look at my LinkedIn, and they're like, yeah, like, what kind of job are you looking for? Because my LinkedIn has every job I've ever done.
Sure.
And so any recruiter looking at my LinkedIn, they're like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's like, I don't know either. Because I've got management experience, I've got engineering experience, I've got developer relations experience, I've got teaching experience. And so people are like, how do we utilize that? And so some of the roles that I've been applying for are just management roles or just developer relations roles. I did some engineering interviews as well for just an engineering role. But then you kind of get the hybrid of like, hey, we want you to manage a DevRel team, or we want you to be a director over like director experience kind of thing, which is a component of education and DevRel. Or, we want you to just be like a lead DevRel to kind of like focus on one area of our product, that sort of thing. I have had a few people reach out like, hey, would you come and teach? And I'm like, well, maybe as a consultant kind of level, but I'm not looking for like that full time, like go back to a school to teach. I'm okay with it, but I like to focus on like deeper engineering things, which kind of drew me more into like the developer relations side, where I can teach like different concepts of different companies and sort of share that and see that reach and do a lot of like the product education type of thing. So that's really the kind of thing I've been focusing on in the job hunt, and most of the job offers that I've got or waiting on are DevRel. which is like going giving conference talks or some sort of advocacy or live streaming or putting together workshops and hackathons and things like that. Because I like public speaking, although it's all virtual right now. But I'm looking forward to the day that we can hop back on an airplane and go to a tech conference and just nerd out with fellow nerds and geek out over deeper things.
Yeah, you touched on a little bit. Can you just share for people who might not know what developer relations roles actually look like? Because I think it's something that has grown quite a bit that I've seen over the last 5 years. It's whole like it started maybe tech evangelist, developer evangelist, then kind of developer relations, and it feels like at least when I first heard about it, I was like, oh, is this marketing or is this engineering or some combination of the two, right? So could you just share a little bit of insight into what those roles actually look like?
Yeah, I think devrel is a little bit like DevOps. It means different things to different companies.
Yeah.
For some companies, it's all about, okay, you're going to go educate people about our company and about our product, and that's all it is it's product education. For others, it's more of the thought leadership, and you happen to work for our company, and so you're kind of like, hey, I've got a cool idea for some serverless project. And as part of that, I'm going to show you how I use such and such a product where I happen to work. But this is a talk about like serverless, or this is a talk about, Internet of Things, but it's going to push data to, such and such a cloud offering because I happen to work there. And so we can see what happens on the dashboard or something like that. And so every company treats it a little bit differently. Some DevRel teams are just really focused on content, whether it's written content, video content, streaming content, and then whether it's like live video or pre-recorded video and webinars or tech talks, or whether you're actually going to a technical conference and speaking in front of crowds, building events, where people can come and just like it's a day-long event or a multi-day event, like a workshop, or you're going to run like a hackathon over a weekend and you just have tons of people show up and just kind of nerd out on whatever your product is or mishmash a whole bunch of APIs. I remember going to some DevRel events in the past where it was a whole bunch of API-based companies, and they would just get together and it's like, here's our API, here's our API, here's our API. Go build something cool. We're going to judge them at the end, and we're going to give away like $10,000 worth of prizes. And people will just figure out how to mash things up and come up with really cool product ideas. But DevRel means a lot of things. And in the DevRel community, we kind of focus on what we call the 3 C's, which is content, community, and code. And so the community aspect is like, how do we take care of the people that need to learn, that we want to kind of raise up and make better? The content is, is it product content? Is it just thought leadership content? And then the associated code with that. Is there an example app that we're working on, or some sort of sample of, some little snippet of code to kind of get you started with some kind of aspect of our product, or just the thought leadership that we're doing? And so those tend to be like the top 3 things that we really focus on in DevRel.
That's really helpful. I think it's an interesting space that probably a lot of people that come from bootcamp backgrounds as well, or non-traditional engineering backgrounds, if you have some experience in some area that might lean towards that, is something that I've seen people be interested in, right? If you come from sales or you come from marketing and now you're an engineer, a couple years in, you go, oh, this might make a lot of sense, right? If you still like that people focused side of things instead of just being keyboard focused all day, right?
Yeah, and there are really 2 aspects to DevRel. Like there's the aspect of people that like to be in front of people and people that just want to help people. And so if you've done like a pre-sales engineering where you're okay being on a phone call, but that's like the limit of your capacity of like dealing with other people, then you might be drawn more to the content side of DevRel. If you're really outgoing and really extroverted and you love getting on stage and giving a talk, or even if you're not extroverted, but you've got a lot of knowledge in something and you're willing to go give a talk, then maybe more of the community side of DevRel could be for you. But yeah, because it's such a wide variety of what does DevRel mean to a company. There's a lot of opportunity out there for sure.
Yeah, interesting. Great. Well, back to the interviewing side of things. When you're typically evaluating, or I guess, what are you typically evaluating for when you're interviewing someone for your team or teams you built in the past?
Good question. There's certainly the aspect of you need to have some amount of technical skill to join the team, and so that varies a lot based on your level. If you're coming in at an entry level, I'm going to expect more about your process and your communication, how well you can learn. Where a more senior person, I'm going to be looking for how do you optimize your code, how do you make your code faster, how do you make it better, or some aspect of that. But also, how well do you explain why you're doing what you're doing? Because as I hire a senior dev, I'm not just hiring you to write really awesome code or to optimize other code. I also want you to raise up everybody else to get to where you are. And you're going to do that most effectively by explaining the how and the why. And so as I interview a more senior dev, I'm hoping to hear more of like, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do, but this is why I'm doing it this way. Whereas an entry level dev or someone earlier in their career, I might focus more on what's your process? How well are you communicating it? Do you even have a process to follow? And then what's your communication skill like? And if I throw a little nugget at you, how quickly do you kind of learn and apply that? And that could be, hey, for part of this take home assignment, like I want you to build this, based on your experience, you might have to go learn this extra aspect, but let's see what you can do. And then I'll evaluate that when it comes in and go, hey, look what they learned. Look how they were able to apply it in a short amount of time. That shows me that they're going to be a great employee where they're willing to take that initiative and dive in and be happy to learn something. Some people are a little more opposed to like the learning aspect. They get pretty locked in on this is what I've learned, this is what I know, and this is what I want to do. Where I'm looking for people who tend to, not tend to, but are willing to sort of transfer that knowledge into other areas. So if you're coming out of a boot camp where you only studied full stack JavaScript, that's fine. If I've got like a backend role in Python, you're going to be able to transfer that knowledge, but are you willing to? That makes a big difference for me as a hiring manager. And so I might put some feelers out there of like, where are your interests taking you? What do you want to be doing, 6 months from now, a year from now, a couple of years from now? And some people don't know, and that's okay too. Especially when you're early in your career. Your first job doesn't have to be your dream job. Your first job doesn't have to be an amazing job, but it's at least letting you make progress in your career. There's a quote that I heard from a guy. I follow some of his stuff on Instagram, but sometimes he's a little extreme in his thinking. His name is Jordan Peterson. And he talks about like helping college grads figure out what they want to do. And they get so paralyzed by, I'm here right now and I don't want to move forward because I don't know what I want to do. And he's like, just take a chance and at least move forward, because then even if you realize that's not what you want to do, you're in a different position and you can see the world from a different perspective. But if you only stay where you are and say, well, I could go this way, I could go this way, I could go this way, you're not going to get a different perspective until you actually make a move and make a journey in some direction. And then from there, now you can say, okay, well, I tried that for 6 months or a year. Turns out I don't want to do that. I'm going to go focus on this and I'm going to pivot my career a little bit. That's okay to do, especially early in your career. How you tell that story is also an important part of the interview process when it comes to, why were you only at that job for 6 months or 8 months or a year? And then, you changed, several times. It's like, well, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And now I've got that kind of locked in and your company's doing that. And that's why I want to apply for this job. We're in charge of telling that story when we go to an interview. And so even if you don't know what you want to do, being able to explain the journey that you've taken and where you're going with that journey is sometimes enough to kind of win them over. So those are the kinds of things I listen for when I'm interviewing someone.
Yeah, those are great points. I think about that idea a lot, about kind of taking the leap. It was something that I thought about when I basically any big career move I had to make, like when I went from being a individual contributor recruiter to a manager, and then from a manager running an office. They were all things that I went, this is terrifying, right? And I don't really know how to do this at all. But what was always in the back of my head was, well, if everything goes wrong and I'm terrible at this, I could always go back to being a recruiter again, right? Like, but the worst case scenario is I'm just a senior recruiter again. Right. That's okay, right? And kind of thought the same thing, moving engineering roles from my first job into this one, which was like, it certainly seems like it's going to be more difficult. But worst case scenario, I could probably call my old company. They might hire me back. If not, I could probably find another job that was pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
So it does feel like if you take the leap, you can usually obviously there's a lot of privilege when I say this, but you could probably find a way to get back into a similar role, right? If everything goes terribly wrong, right? So.
Well, that brings up two interesting points that I'd like to touch on. The first one being some people are getting out of that job because they don't want to do that anymore. Working at Turing, for 4 years, we got a lot of people coming in going, I didn't want to do sales anymore. I didn't want to work in the medical field anymore. I didn't want to do this or that anymore. I want to be a developer. And so they really struggle for what kind of job do I go get? Because I don't want to have to fall back on that if I can help it. That's why I came to a boot camp. That's why I'm paying this money for this new education. On the flip side of that, though, my second point is sometimes that's the easiest way back into tech is to kind of lean into an industry where you've been in the past. And so if you've done, let's say you worked in medical systems in the past, well, now as a developer, like that's going to be a really easy entry point for you to get back in as a developer to go work for a medical company, but now as a developer, because you understand the user experience, you understand the pain points they had having used those kinds of systems and software and what was good about it, what was bad about it. Well, now you can take that as part of your intro story of why do you want to work here? It's like, I used to use these kinds of systems. They're garbage. I want to make that better. And here's how I've been improving myself so I can come and make an impact and make that a really good user experience for the next people that have to use that product. Now, obviously, you wouldn't go to a company and tell them their company or their product is garbage, but you get what I'm saying. Sometimes that's an easier path into that first job by relying on something that you've previously done. Not always. Like if you're coming from food service, you can't exactly like just jump into tech, but maybe the parent company that owned that restaurant or the parent company that owns that parent company that owns the restaurant, like maybe they're hiring for like the point of sale system or the little menu things that you get on the tables nowadays, the little digital menus. Like there's some aspect in there that you could probably find an easier way, an easier path back into tech by going back to the kind of company where you've worked in the past. But if you're absolutely opposed of, for some reason, it's like, no, I had to get out of that for reasons. That's okay too. But being able to explain that story as part of the interview process is very likely going to get you that first job much easier, especially with the networking component that we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And even things that are kind of adjacent to that industry that you might have come in. Like I work at levels at FYI right now, and we are involved in compensation data, right? And basically salary comparison, which is not directly related to recruiting, but it is close enough that like I have a lot of knowledge about this industry. That's certainly helpful. But it allowed me to not go work for, Greenhouse or some direct recruiting related tech company. And that's actually been great because I think I was a little burnt out on recruiting as a whole, right? But having this knowledge is certainly helpful. At least I know what we're talking about versus I was doing like insurance consulting before, insurance tech stuff, and like a lot of stuff that just was totally over my head, which then I had to like just play that much more catch up to try to figure it out, right?
Right.
Do you have any type of standardized system that you use whenever you're interviewing, you're doing technicals, or does it kind of change depending on the role or the person?
It would change on the role, but not necessarily on the person. Typically, I would do a 4-point scale across like multiple sort of components. And so as a hiring manager, I would have a rubric that I would share with my team, or, when I was part of a hiring team, we sort of developed a 4-point rubric. And the reason we use an even numbers, so there's no middle ground. And so it would be like strong yes, weak no, strong no, but there's no middle ground. There's no maybe. It's like, well, did they answer it or not? And if they answered it, did they answer well? Or was it like, yeah, it was okay? Or it was like, no, it was a little bit inaccurate, or no, it was like grossly wrong. Or they just didn't have an answer at all. And so by having an even number, it's not just a binary yes, no, but you can also add like a little bit of strength to it of like, yeah, it was an amazing answer. Or like, yeah, they understood enough. Or there were enough inaccuracies that, maybe they're a little shaky on that subject versus like, no, it was like totally wrong, or they just didn't have an answer. And it brings up an important point too, that you don't have to have all of the answers when you go into an interview. You don't have to be an expert in everything. My job as the interviewer is to gauge what you know and what you don't know. And it's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay not to be an expert in things, especially early in your career. We know that you don't know all the things, but we do have to figure out the depth of your knowledge and then the breadth of your knowledge of like how many things do you know and then how well do you know those things. That's how I think about with or breadth and depth. But you don't have to be an expert, but I do have to test your limits. And so I might ask a couple of questions even if it feels like, oh, I already kind of said I didn't know that thing. Why are you still asking me these questions? It's like, well, maybe I'm just looking at it from a slightly different angle, or see if I can jog your memory or something like that on something that I think you might have learned and you've just forgotten. That's really my job as an interviewer. And so that rubric wouldn't change. But, based on the role, like an entry level role, my questions would be a little different. More senior roles would go like much more into technical detail, where again, like I mentioned earlier in another question, like for an entry level or early career person, it might be more about your process and your communication. And so I would look at, communication skills, coding skills, problem solving, just generally speaking, and then like behavioral questions, or like what sorts of scenarios have you been a part of? What do you have experience with as far as working with other people, working on a team, things like that? Have you done group projects, or has it all been solo projects? Things like that. That would fall kind of more into the behavioral category. But then being able to talk about like just, hey, how does HTTP work? Like when I type in an address in a browser and I hit enter, what happens? How much of that can you speak to? Can you talk about DNS? Can you talk about what's actually in the HTTP request and response itself? How do cookies get transmitted back and forth? What actually happens on the back end if you're a back end developer, or if you're on the front end, once you get that payload of content, what's your browser actually doing with that? Like, how does your browser actually parse that and put it together? When does JavaScript actually run when it gets that payload of data? Like, so when you're answering that question of how does the internet work, that's the backbone of everything we do as web developers. And so we should have a pretty well prepared answer for that. But you don't have to be an expert in each component of those things. But you should at least be able to describe like your focus. So if you're a front end developer, you should know how the browser works. Not deep, intricate detail, but you should have some idea of like, it gets that initial HTML payload and it'll start parsing out. It'll figure out what other resources it needs, and then like multi-thread to go back and fetch those. It'll start to like render out the content, but once those styles load, it'll go back and restyle kind of on the fly. If it sees JavaScript in the body, it's going to run that now. Otherwise, if it's on like a document ready event, it'll wait for that everything else to load and render, and then it fires that event. And now it's going to like maybe go run some Ajax. Like being able to describe those sorts of components as a front end developer. We're a back end developer. You better tell me everything that's going on in your framework. Like, how does it even get the request? How does it parse it? How does it get content out of the database? Like, tell me everything about how it's taking in the request and building that response. If you're full stack, you should be able to touch a little bit on both. But again, I wouldn't expect really deep technical knowledge until you've progressed in your career and you have sort of exposed yourself to more of that.
I'm going to take that 30-second clip of you explaining what the internet is on the front end and just replay that before any interviews I have. So I haven't answered that question now.
It's fun because I've actually been asked that question several times over my recent interviews. It's like, okay, well, if I type in this address, what can you tell me? I'm like, how much information do you want to know? And they're like, go as deep as you can. I'm like, all right, well, the browser's going to ask your operating system, have we ever been to this site before? Have we cached the IP? And if not, it's going to go do a DNS lookup on port 53. And you see people like, okay, I didn't mean like that level of depth. Yeah. Like I actually had one person stop and go, okay, fine. Like that's okay. And I'm like, I taught this stuff for 4 years. Like it's pretty fresh in my mind. Plus I've been using this for, a couple of decades. So, I'm not going to be an expert at every component, but how deep do you want me to go on any particular part? Because I can dive in for sure.
Yeah. I find those types of, or at least that exact question kind of frustrating when I'm in interviews, mostly because I feel like from a early career perspective, like I think about that from time to time, but only the most practical or functional, I'm trying to think of the right word for it, the pieces of that actually impact. Like if I'm trying to do some front end work and make changes to a page, I don't think about really any of that, right? Unless something
Sure.
goes wrong and I'm like, I have to see what the actual, like what I'm actually receiving or what the actual network, like I'm clicking one little tab though, just to make sure when I'm troubleshooting something, right? So those types of questions, I'm always trying to like balance my head. Like, how important is that for me to go and learn, because it doesn't feel like something I'm going to pick up in my day to day necessarily, or maybe little bits and
No, I get it.
pieces, right? Versus like, you know, that's just good knowledge to have because it is something that I am doing every day, and it probably would be useful if I had it, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think you kind of nailed it. Like, what's the practical portion of this that I deal with day to day? Like, that's really what you can sort of get across in the interview of like, I've studied this, but this is the part where I focused like most of my attention. Like, how is the browser actually like rendering the stuff out after the fact, or how's the JavaScript engine like actually parsing through data or whatever. But I think especially if you're coming straight out of school, they're probably asking you that question just to see, what did your school teach you or boot camp or whatever, or like how much of that theory do you even understand? Like I said, it is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the backbone of what we do in web development, and so it at the same time it does kind of tip on the, are you just asking like for trivia based knowledge? Because there's also pros and cons to that in interviews of like, is that really helpful to know? But if there are components about the job where you need to understand like the amount of data that you're transmitting or receiving from a user, and you're using that to like rate limit people or something like that for like deeper API integration, then yeah, being able to understand how things actually transmit and so on does make a big difference about, does your browser, your client software support like gzip compression, so we're reducing the amount of traffic that we're actually sending? Or do you support HTTP2, where instead of making an HTTP or making a TCP/IP connection to the server, getting one resource and then closing that connection, then reopening the connection, asking for the next resource and closing that connection? Or do you support HTTP2, where I can hold that connection open and just request a whole bunch of resources and then close that connection because that speeds things up? Or I can just send over a list of all the resources and you just stream them all back to me. Like, having a deeper understanding of that, I think, comes with time, and it comes with, okay, well, as a senior level dev, I'm going to model more for that latter stage because I'm going to care more about internet traffic and data payloads and things like that. And so a lot of it is just, what have you been experienced or exposed to in your career? And there are like technical challenges where I might expect, I might give a part of a problem just to hear about like, what have you done as far as optimizing code or caching or something like that? Like, do you like has that even been part of your experience? If not, that's okay. But if you do, especially earlier in your career, that can make a big difference in an interview of like, oh wow, you've actually been around a lot more. I've actually raised people up in their interviews where it's like, oh, well, Taylor's like kind of that intermediate level. But in that interview, I'm like, dang, Taylor's actually got some senior level experience based on some of this. And I actually brought someone in at a senior level, even though they really had like intermediate years of experience, but what they had done in those years was senior level. So I advocated for them. I'm like, no, we need to give them a senior title. We're going to bring them in at this pay range. And my VP of engineering fought back and like, no, they don't have the years of experience. I'm like, it's not about the years of experience. It's the experience in the years. It's that old cliche. I'm like, the work that they have done justifies it in this case. Trust me. They brought them in at a senior level and they flourished and they did amazing. And at the same time, it can sometimes raise the anxiety of that person a little bit too, of like, I thought I was coming in at an intermediate level. Now you have senior level expectations. But if you've had that experience, like, why not?
Yeah.
Like, if like we're showing you as a company, we believe in you. If we're going to bring you in at that level, that means you've passed our standard. We believe you can do that job. And so, yeah, it might raise your anxiety, but hopefully we're building up that trust as a company to support you and say, like, whatever level we bring you in at, we believe you can do the job at that level. And it happens the same way if you have to like sort of downgrade someone's experience as well, of like, you applied for that senior role. We're going to bring you in at an intermediate because you're missing, certain things. Sometimes though we can't give that feedback, but that's usually what's happening is we recognize like, oh, just not quite enough of your experience matches, sort of this rubric that we're looking for that more senior level, whether from junior to intermediate or intermediate to senior and onward. And that's why we need to bring you down a level. That happens too in recruiting. I'm sure you've been there as a recruiter of like having to adjust people either way. It's like, you know what, you really wowed us, we're going to bring you up, or it's like, you're missing a few things, we're going to bring you down. And then hopefully, you keep the candidate around when you do that.
So sure. If I saw that too much with a company, I used to try to get them like, can we change the level? Like if every person we send to a lead ends up in a senior role, except for one, are we really looking for a lead, or are we looking for like an architect or something, right? Like what is this role actually for, right? But
for sure.
I am curious, how do you think you do technical interviews? I mean, I guess there's kind of both perspectives, as an interviewer or as a candidate, right? But you've been on both sides a lot, right? And recently, so.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm doing okay on the candidate side because I've got multiple offers to juggle right now. It's definitely nerve-wracking though, as a candidate, like having to go through these things, especially with, more than 2 decades of experience and you're still expected to jump through leak code challenges. But the devrel interview experience is quite different from like a full software engineer type of experience. There's still some aspect of coding, but it's a lot more like, hey, can you put together a little technical talk where there's coding involved, but it's not like, here's a leak code problem, jump through a hoop. But as an interviewer, I think the biggest thing that I realized is not a lot of companies train their interviewers. They're just like, hey, Taylor, I got someone coming in at 1. Can you go find a problem to give them? Or here's like a bank of questions, just, go see how they do. And that's it. That's all you get. And, it's like, well, do I come out and just give you a gut check of like, yeah, I think they're going to be okay, or no, like something seemed off, or like, a lot of companies don't train their interviewers. And so that's kind of a big game changer for me, is making sure that when I was in a position of management or leadership, of making sure that everyone else on the team understood what the interview process was going to be. And then like really helping train up other people to understand what kinds of questions to ask and why, what kinds of questions you're not allowed to ask and why. One interview I remember being at, it was a great interview. I was doing really well technically. And it was a founder of a startup, and they had brought in one of their other developers. And the other developer at the end is like, all right, well, now we got to get to the real important question. Are you an ale guy or a lager guy? And the founder's like, dude, you can't ask that question. He like flipped out on him in the interview. He's like, you can't ask that. It's illegal. You can't ask about alcohol consumption, blah, blah, like.
Oh, really?
But I mean,
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, no, you're not allowed to ask those kinds of questions. But this interviewer had no idea, but at the same time, it was kind of a culture check because it's startup land, early engineer. You've always got like a kegerator or some sort of beer fridge going on, whatever. I'm not a big drinker, at least not anymore. But it, like, for me as a candidate, I kind of laughed it off. I'm like, yeah, whatever, I prefer lagers over ales. But yeah, there's questions you're not allowed to ask. And so preparing an interviewer for like, these are the kinds of questions that you should ask. These are the kinds of questions you absolutely cannot ask. And topics to avoid, like don't talk about their kids. If you see a wedding band, don't ask about, are they married? How long they've been married? Like, not allowed to ask that stuff. It's illegal in a lot of places. And where it's not illegal, it probably should be. You're not allowed to ask about like religious backgrounds, alcohol consumption, even like casual drug use, in states where it's legal. Like, you're not allowed to ask those kinds of things. And so as a manager, I would always make sure that my teams were at least somewhat adequately prepared to like go into an interview and understand how to interview and why. As a candidate though, it's really easy now for me to spot people that have actually been experienced interviewers, that have been doing it for a while, even a year and a half of like, oh, okay, you're actually really good at asking these questions and coming up with follow-up questions where it doesn't just sound like a scripted, let me ask you this, now let me ask you this, now let me ask you this. But when you can answer a question and they're like, okay, wait, tell me more about this aspect, and you can tell they're going off script, then it's like, all right, cool. You're a good interviewer. If you can go off script and then kind of bring it back and sort of, kind of like we're doing here, you can kind of bring the topic back to center, but you're willing to go off topic for a minute, just, to give you that deeper knowledge about the person. So understanding how and when and why to do those things, and then sort of how to gauge their answers and come up with some sort of score about it. It doesn't have to be a strict like, oh, well, Taylor got the job because he got 82%. And Ian doesn't get the job because he only got 81%. So we have to hire Taylor because he got a higher score. It's like, well, no, there are other factors in there as well. But, having a way to treat everybody fairly. I'm a big believer and big fan in like equality and equity when it comes to those things. You need to treat everybody fairly. You need to score everybody the same so that everybody has an equal chance and equal, I know equal opportunity sounds weird, but like everybody has the same opportunity to come and join your team. And so the best way to do that is to have a fair process where you're treating everybody fairly. You're screening everybody the same way. You're asking the same kinds of questions. And I'm not asking you a particularly hard question because you have a CS degree, and I'm not asking a boot camp grad like a really easy question because I know they don't have a CS background. Like that's already tipping the bias, based on their education backgrounds. Like, well, just, my technical challenge should be in line with what my company does. And so I should be asking everybody the same kind of question, maybe not the exact same question, but it needs to be a similar enough question, similar level, that we get a really good sense of how do people sort of rate against each other and then make a decision as a team from there.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the rubric, and I had a rubric when I was building a recruiting office, and I don't know, it was very different than every other recruiting office I'd ever worked at. It was the gut check, right? Where you go in and you talk to someone for a half hour, and then, you come out and someone goes, so what do you think? And you go, oh, good. Yeah, we should hire him. Or, I don't know. Right. That was about the extent of the, if more people than not said, good, then they got an offer. Right. I think just having at least something that you can point to, right? And you mentioned this earlier, like a 4-point system too, I think is so important. Or at least something where there's no middle ground. Because otherwise a lot of people end up in that maybe spot, right? We're like, what do you feel? They might be a good fit, right? It's like, what does that mean?
Yeah, is that a yes or a no? Like,
right.
we actually got to a point where we would kind of score those things, but then we would all kind of like debrief at the end and say, like we would ask questions like, should we hire this person? Like just overall, like yes or no, what do people think? Would anybody be disappointed if we don't hire this person? Because maybe someone's like, I really want that person, to be part of my team or, whatever. And then we would ask, okay, well, if we're going to hire this person, who wants them on their team? And kind of get a check from there. So like at one company I was at, this person came in and interviewed, and they were the smartest person in the room above all of us. Like they blew us all away with how well they could break a problem down, how well they coded their technical challenges, the behavioral scenarios that they'd been in. Like they crushed everything about this interview. And at the end of it, we're debriefing and we're like, should we hire this person? Everyone's like, they're brilliant. And we got to the stage of like, who wants them on their team? Not a single person said yes. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's go around the room. Let's find out like, why doesn't anybody want them on their team? And the consensus was they were kind of arrogant about it. Like they knew they were the smartest person there, and they weren't very humble about it. And that was one of our main things, criteria for culture. It was at SendGrid, and we had what we call our 4 H's. It was happy, hungry, honest, and humble. And they drastically failed on the humility side of like, they came in and they're like, oh, I'm the greatest gift, to programming. And they just came across like kind of that, okay, you're smart, but I don't want to work with you. And so we didn't make them an offer. And like the candidate got kind of ticked off. They're like, why? I did really well. It's like, yeah, but nobody wants you on the team. I mean, we can't tell them that. But we basically said like, yeah, you're not going to be a good culture fit. And we just had to leave it at that. We couldn't give them any more feedback beyond that because that's when it starts feeling discriminatory and whatever. And that's the reason that some companies don't want to give that sort of feedback, because you can give some amount of feedback of like, it just wasn't a culture fit, or you were lacking enough on the technical skill that if we demote your role, like would you still take it? But if it's something cultural where just people don't want to work with you, I would rather save my team the anguish of, hey, we're going to hire this person and no one on the team wants to work with you, and I start losing other people on the team because of that. I'm not gonna do that to my team. You know, my job, especially in management, is to take care of my team and to remove blockers. I'm not going to introduce a blocker by bringing someone on the team that nobody wants to work with.
Yeah, they'd have to be able to do the work of, them plus all the other people who might leave because of them, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Seems like that's going to be a rare.
And I mean, they might have been smart enough to do it, but I didn't want to take that chance.
Sure. I hear it. So can you repeat those two questions? Because those are, I mean, that's the exact type of stuff that I think people are looking for. It's, does anyone want this person on this team? Is anyone going to be disappointed if we don't hire them? Those are two questions.
those are the main ones. So like the first ones, we kind of go around, we kind of gather everybody's rubric scores, and then, not very strictly, match up, okay, well, this person got like 82% or something, but it was enough of like, were there enough like weak yes, strong yes sort of scenarios? Were there any like drastic, like strong no's that anybody got? So we would kind of like dive in on some of the rubric a little bit. And then from there, we would just say like, hey, as a team, should we hire this person? So that was number one. Like, should we hire this person? Is it going to be a good technology fit on the team? Yes or no? And then we would kind of get a consensus there, and then we would ask those other two questions of, would anybody be disappointed if we did not hire this person? And then, with this one person, like no one would have been disappointed if we did not hire them. And then the more important one is, who wants them on their team? Because we had several different people from across different teams interviewing them, partially to get rid of bias and do like culture checks against one another. And so like, who wants them on their team? And then we would get those people together and say, okay, if we make them an offer, like what were their technological strengths? Where do we see them fitting in the best as far as like a team match and technology match, and as well as giving them opportunity to grow. Because I think if you take a job where you have 100% of the skill and no growth, you're going to get bored at that job and leave.
Yeah.
But if I can hire you where you've got like 75% of the skill and 25% like where you're going to grow, you're more likely to stay because you're going to get engaged and like on that learning level. And especially if you see that us as a company, we're willing to invest in you to help you grow in those areas, it can sometimes spark a little bit of loyalty, and you're more likely to stick around. So those are like the three questions of, should we hire them? And then from there, would anybody be disappointed if we don't? And then who wants them on their team?
Yeah, I love those last two because it almost gives some of the chance to fight for a candidate that they feel strongly about.
Right.
Either way, right? The first one, just like, oh, they said this during the interview that I thought was so great. Like, this is why, and at least give someone a chance to bring that up. Versus, I feel like if you're not asking that type of question, someone goes, am I going to risk my political capital to go out on a limb for this person I met for 30 minutes in an interview? Maybe, right?
For sure.
But if it's built into the process, that I think that makes it much more likely to actually happen. Right? That's great.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have any type of system that you use to break down technical questions? I think you mentioned, right, going through the leak code grind and having companies throw, really anything at you in these interviews, because you often don't know. It could, you might even go into a devrel role where they're like, okay, great, here's a whiteboarding question, right? So do you have any system you use to break it down, especially if it's something where you don't immediately go, oh, I know how to do this, right?
Yeah. And honestly, I've been around long enough where every new problem I see, I'm like, wait, how do I do this? So I have a 4-point system that I use. I know I do a lot of point things on the talk here, but I follow a 4-point system. The first one is repeat that problem back in your own words, just to make sure like you understand kind of the nature of what the problem is. And so don't just like, especially if it's like shared on the screen, that you're not just like reading it back, but like collect your thoughts for a moment and say, okay, if I understand right, you're asking me to solve a problem that does blah, 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 and like put it in your own words. And try to account for like edge cases and things like that as well. From there, the second one is ask questions. While you're thinking about it and while you're sort of repeating it back to them, you're probably going to have some questions in mind. Sometimes questions leave out edge cases specifically because they want to see like, are they going to ask me about that? Because it's a kind of a curiosity check of like, oh wait, what would happen if this kind of input happened? Or like, is this array of numbers that you're giving me, are they always going to be positive? Is it always going to be ascending? Like, is it ever going to be mixed? Is it ever going to be negative? Will it ever be float values? Like, just try to ask some clarifying questions. And sometimes that'll help you understand edge cases, and it'll kind of drive your thinking a little bit more about like, oh, well, if that's the case, then could this ever happen? That's sometimes what a lot of interviewers are listening for, of like, if I give you a real problem on the job, are you going to kind of push back and say, well, not push back, but like ask questions, but like, hey, wait, have we thought about how the customer might do this, or what sort of scenario if the customer does that? Because those are the kinds of questions I would want you to raise if I hire you on my team and I give you some work to do. I want to know that you're going to ask good questions about that. So part 2 is ask questions. Part 3, then I would say plan out the work that you're going to do. Write out some notes. More effectively sometimes is writing out pseudocode, which is hard with some higher level languages because, a lot of high level languages are practically pseudocode already. And I joke a lot about that, especially with Python. But when I write out pseudocode, my pseudocode looks a lot like Python. But I tell people, like, write pseudocode like you're writing a food recipe, like crack an egg in a bowl. Don't write your pseudocode so specific, like hold the egg this way, tap it this way, pull the shell apart, make sure it drops into the bowl. Like, your pseudocode can just literally take the form of like crack an egg in a bowl, like loop over the array. Now inside that loop, look for this value or that value, or compare this value with the one following it, or something. Like, write it high level enough that you're kind of getting the point across to the interviewer. But it's really for you to shape what it is you're about to go build in the real code. But it helps you communicate your design decisions and your problem solving as well to the interviewer. Now, by that point, you've already done most of the problem solving, but it might help you get into those edge cases and those corner cases a little bit more. And so by writing out the pseudocode, it's a little more of your design knowledge. Like, how do you design the code that you're about to build? And again, for the senior level devs, like, why are you going to do it that way? And then from there, you ask the interviewer, what's your opinion of this? I tell people to word it that way as opposed to, does this look okay to you? Am I on the right track? Because that kind of projects a lack of confidence in yourself of like, does this look all right? Or am I on the right track here? It's like, well, if you're not confident, what should my expectation be as the interviewer? And so I coach people, like, just ask them, what's your opinion of this? And they'll tell you. If you're at an on-site interview, they already want to hire you. They're looking for a reason to say yes. When I'm screening resumes, I've got thousands of these things. I'm looking for a reason to say no. Like, any little thing about that resume, like no, maybe, no, yes, no, maybe. Like, because I got so many of these to get through, I'm literally skimming them, like, to look for reasons to not call you. But once I get you into that interview process, I think you can do the job. I'm hoping to say yes. And so interviewers will help. They will give you an honest opinion. If they think you're missing something about an edge case or something like that, they're going to start asking you questions about, like, hey, tell me a little bit more about that data structure you want to use. Like, why are you choosing that one? And that's not, it shouldn't ever come across like, why are you choosing that one? But it should come across as a genuine curiosity, like, hey, tell me more about why you chose to use an array versus a hash in that scenario. Or, what are some other choices you could make about that return type? Because I want to make sure that you're thinking through that design a little bit deeper. People that just jump straight into code, they tend to refactor the code a lot more later. And debugging the code can sometimes be harder. And so by writing out the pseudocode ahead of time, you're making an upfront investment in your time, and it does take a couple of minutes. But that couple of minutes is usually much shorter than the amount of time you spend refactoring your code and debugging your code later when things go wrong. Or you realize, like, oh, how I started coding that. Now I've kind of put myself in a corner over here, and I got to like go refactor a bunch of code so that I can do this part a little bit differently. And the time that you spend doing all of that and making sure, like, kind of that ripple effect of like, if I change this, it's going to change all these other things. If you just design it out a little bit more before you get started, it alleviates a lot of that. Not entirely, but it tends to reduce it quite a lot. And so you might spend 2 or 3 minutes working through pseudocode. But if you don't, and you just immediately jump into your code, sometimes it can cause like 10, 15 minutes worth of refactoring and debugging. And so it's kind of like test-driven development where you're making that upfront investment in time to reduce the pain later.
Hmm.
And so those are the kind of the fourth stage then I guess is like actually start on the code, like get going because you're on the clock. And so repeat the question to me, ask me questions about it, design what your answer is going to be, and then go get started.
Yeah, that's great. I love the focus too on the pseudocoding, because I think that almost becomes the difficult part rather than the coding, right? Because if you've got that basically modeled and mapped, and you can reference it while you're coding, the code is just putting those, that pseudocode into actual code, and it, I don't know, significantly easier. I try to do that. Sometimes it's hard. I get stuck, when I'm in the pseudocoding process of like, oh, I don't know if I know how to actually solve this, but then I try to at least, okay, let's get down my idea on paper, right? And then we'll come back. And if I actually have to figure out how to do that while I'm coding, okay, well, then at least I've got most of this done.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Great. Do you have any advice or tips for engineers who are going into technical interviews? Again, having just gone through a bunch, and we've kind of talked through this idea, right? What to do if you get stuck. Any other general advice or tips?
It's okay to be nervous. We know you're nervous. And I would say like they're probably nervous too, especially for companies where they don't train their interviewer. They're going to walk into that interview going, I hope I don't say something stupid, or they're not going to want to work here, and then it looks bad on me. Or what if they tell my boss I did an awful job as an interviewer? They're probably nervous too, unless they're like really seasoned and they've been around and they've done interview training. Then it's going to feel like a very natural conversation. I'm a big fan of saying like interviews should be conversation, not interrogation. But it's okay to be nervous. Totally all right to be nervous, and it's okay to take a moment to collect your thoughts. Like as soon as I finish asking a question, you don't have to start speaking right away. It's okay to take 5-10 seconds and, kind of gather your thoughts, as long as I can tell that you're thinking about it, not just like staring at a bug on the wall or something, but like being able to just say like, oh, it's a good question. Let me think about like how I want to answer that. Just give me a second. I'm just going to, whether you're like write out some notes, or I like to jot down the question that they actually ask, so that if I get stumped on something, it's okay to say you don't know. And I could say like, you know what, I don't have a good answer for that. But I would like to kind of follow up on this. Like, is it okay? Can I get your contact info and like follow up with you on this later on? Like as soon as this is over, I'm going to go look that thing up and like go learn about it because I don't have an answer. That can be a big important step too, like showing that you're teachable, that you can go learn something, but also the humility of, I don't know. That makes a big difference. One of my recent interviews, they said, what do you do when you don't know something? And I'm like, I tell people I don't know. Like in a developer relations role, it's a hard thing to do because you're up on a stage or you're doing a webinar, a tech talk, and someone asks a question, you don't have an answer. I mean, the only appropriate answer is I'm going to go find out and I'll get back to you. Like, give me your contact info. I'm going to get back to you. And then later on, they're like, do you have any questions for me? And I asked a question where I stumped them. And they're like, I'm going to take a page out of your book and say, I don't know. I'm like, all right, brilliant answer. It's like you have to have that humility. But yeah, it's okay not to know things. It's okay. Again, my job as the interviewer is to find out what you do know and what you don't know. And it's okay not to have answers. So those would be the main things, is like follow up. Like I always encourage people, like, whether you're reaching out on LinkedIn to send a connection request or even just an in-mail request if you pay for LinkedIn, but just find some way of sending them a note later saying, hey, I really appreciated your time. Thank you for spending that time with me. By the way, here are these topics that we discussed that I didn't have a good answer for. By then they've probably already done their score and they've probably already made a decision, and like following up with them on that is probably not going to sway their decision, but it could for an entry-level dev, because a lot of people don't bother with a thank you note. And so sometimes that'll set you apart, just showing them like, hey, I'm grateful for your time, and sharing that after the fact can make a big difference.
Yeah. And check out Tech Interview Guide too, right? That's the other big tip for people.
For sure. Got a lot of free content on there. There's no ads. And I also do like a daily email series that you can subscribe to as well, where every day you get a couple of questions. And I don't answer the question in the email for most of them. It's just, hey, as a hiring manager, this is why I ask this kind of question, or why this kind of question might be important to me and my company. just to give a bit of a peek behind the curtain of, as a hiring manager, this is what's going through my mind. This is why, my team might ask you this kind of question. And it does focus a lot on early career and web development type of roles. And so the email list won't be appropriate for everybody, but I'm looking at expanding the content right now. But it's all free. There's no ads. The only thing I need is an email address to sign up. And all the other content on the website is totally free. There's no ads on any of the pages, anything like that. I'm just happy to give back to community.
I love it. You mentioned early career. Do you have different advice or the same advice for early career engineers, or maybe people who this is the first or second job?
Um, Honestly, a lot of the advice is going to be the same. Like, just be yourself, be humble about what you know. It's okay to say when you don't know something. Um, I think giving the company feedback on their interview process can also be helpful for them to learn and grow. Like, especially if you have a bad experience, you need to speak up. I've definitely coached people on that in the past where they're like, oh, something felt a little off, especially for, historically marginalized and excluded people in tech, where they do an interview and they'll chat with me afterwards. And they're like, yeah, like I got treated really badly. I'm like, you need to tell them. You need to speak up. You need to tell them like what happened. Otherwise, it's not going to change. Maybe it's that specific interviewer. Like maybe they shouldn't be an interviewer. Maybe they shouldn't be at the company. If it was that drastically bad. And so I'm a big fan of like, while you can also ask them for feedback, you should be providing feedback for them on like, hey, I'm really enjoying this process so far. Like the conversation has been really flowing and it's been really great getting to know the team. Like companies love to hear that, especially if somebody really stood out. Like I really enjoyed that interview with Taylor. Like that was, it meant a lot. We had really good conversation. Like I'm looking forward to like working on the team. They're going to love that. They're going to like go tell Taylor like, hey, that person really enjoyed that interview. Good job. And maybe that's going to get you more involved in interviewing because you're doing a good job as an interviewer. So giving them feedback is just as important as asking them for feedback. But as far as like later in your career, I think a lot of the advice is still applicable. Like, unfortunately, in tech, you're going to have to do the leak code grind for development level jobs. Like it's a necessary evil, I think, right now, because we need you to demonstrate some amount of skill as part of the interview. What I hate about leak code, though, is a lot of companies are like, all right, I'm just going to go find some random problem. And, it has nothing to do with what their company does. And I've certainly experienced that between November and recently, grinding on some of the leak code stuff myself, and then going to an interview where they give you a question that was completely unrelated to what the company does. And that always feels a little off. Like some of the best interviews I've had for an engineering role is like, hey, we're going to have this dashboard product where you have to collect some stats and calculate some stats. And so our interview challenge is exactly that. You're going to go hit an API point. You're going to get some JSON data and calculate like averages or something like that in order to send that back out to like a front end dashboard. That interview experience was amazing, because that's exactly what I'm going to be doing on the job. And so you get to highlight a lot of what you know. It's like, so you get to highlight a lot of what you know, and you get to explain like, hey, for now, as far as the interview goes, for the sake of time, I'm just going to assume that endpoint is always there. It's always going to respond. But I would want to be watching for like 400 errors, 500 errors. This is how I might catch some exceptions around, like if the service goes down, I want to give a good experience to my user. So I need to catch that exception, not just crash and send back my own 500. Like I want to be able to give some kind of response back saying, hey, this didn't work, try again later. Or, if I'm being rate limited, then so are they. So I need to give my user a good experience. And so sometimes you don't even have to implement that stuff, but being able to talk about it during an interview, especially for the more senior devs, I think is an important thing to think about as well.
I call that you're almost hand waving off things, right? Or at least if you're throwing the idea out there, sometimes people, okay, they check that box, right? They don't have to dive into it fully, but they check the box that they know that's a thing, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Great. Well, before we move on to the interview portion, maybe something folks can relate to. Do you have any interviewing horror stories you're willing to share?
I mean, probably one of the worst recent experiences, just kind of touching back on the leak code grind. One company asked a question. It was like, go find, like we're going to call a method and we're going to pass in an n value, and we want to find the nth closest like latitude, longitude points against a target point. So your parameters are going to be this n value and a target latitude, longitude, and you're going to have like an array of latitude and longitude points. And we want to find the end points that are closest to that target. And half of the time I'm trying to solve this problem, I'm like, okay, I know it's a heap problem. I know I have to sort the data in some way. So I'm, probably want to use a heap and so on. I'm trying to break it down in my head. But honestly, more of my brain cycles were like, why are you asking me this kind of question? Your company does nothing with geolocation. You have nothing to do with latitude and longitude. Like, this is so unrelated to what you do. A nightmare on my part. Back in the day, back in like 2005, 2006, I was interviewing at Yahoo when it was cool to work at Yahoo back then. It's still cool to work at Yahoo, but it wasn't like the glamorous place to go work, or it was back in 2005, 2006. And so I get to this interview and I think I'm crushing the technical side. Like, everything they're asking me, I'm doing really well. They stumped me on one problem. And at the end of it, they're like, all right, well, we're going to switch gears and we're going to ask you some different questions. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, they're going to switch to like behavioral questions or whatever. And I'm like, all right, let's do it. And they're like, who won the last Super Bowl? And I'm like, and so I'm like, I don't know. And they're like, okay, who's your favorite quarterback? And I'm like, I'm just going to mention like some quarterback name that I know. And they're like, who are your like favorite 3 teams? So I name 3 teams that I happen to know were football teams. And they're like, do you know who won the last Heisman Trophy? I'm like, no. And they're like, well, what about this stat? And what about that stat? And I'm like, why all the football questions? And they're like, you're interviewing with a fantasy football team here at Yahoo, right? And I'm like, oh crap, no. I'm like, the recruiter told me to study design patterns on the way up here, not football stats. Like, and I'm like, okay, here's the deal. I'm from Canada. We have the CFL, not the NFL. Our field is 110 yards long and it's narrower. We get 3 downs instead of 4. We don't have the Super Bowl. We have the Grey Cup. And they're like, don't care. And so I didn't get the job because I wasn't a culture fit, because I don't give a rip about football. It's like, ask me hockey stats. And they're like, we're not fantasy hockey. We're fantasy football. I'm like, I'm from Canada though. Like, literally ask me anything about hockey. I'll tell you anything about hockey, like Stanley Cup winners, like the whole bit, like any team, I'll name like the top 5 players on every team. Like, ask me anything about NHL. And they're like, no, we don't care.
Much smaller fantasy hockey
for sure
population.
Yeah, and so that was like the worst one for me, because on a technical level I matched everything, but they didn't want me on the team because I wasn't going to be bringing that culture passion every day of like, I love the NFL, I know everything about the NFL. And so for me, that was like the one that sticks out to me of like where I absolutely was not a culture fit for the team. But on a technical level, I was going to bring the skill, but I wouldn't have given a rip about what I was doing day to day. And so they didn't hire me.
Sure. Well, I mean, maybe that's a good thing in the long run, right? If you didn't really want that job.
For sure.
That's a fun story, though. Great. Well, then let's take a little break here. When we come back, we'll move on to the technical portion.
Sounds great.
Thank you for watching the first half of the Professional Technical Interviewee. The technical interview will be released 1 week from this episode, so be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett, or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.